Thank you for joining IAB There.
Hi, everybody. I'm Brad Behrens, editor-in-chief here at the IAB. Welcome to IAB There, our regular streaming show where we connect the digital advertising ecosystem. 2021 is an exciting year for so many reasons, but one of those reasons is that it is the 25th anniversary of the founding of the IAB. Over the course of this year, we will be welcoming a few people who were there at the time, who've been there ever since, in order to get a sense of the history of the IAB, where it's been, and also where it's going. Today, on today's show, I'm thrilled to welcome Rich Lafergie. He was the founding chair of the IAB today. He's the director of the 4A's Institute of Advanced Advertising Studies. He also runs Archer Advisors. He's an old friend. We're going to talk about where digital advertising has come since its inception of the IAB back in '96. Rich, let's bring him onto the stream. Rich, welcome to IAB There. I'm so happy to see you.
Well, thank you so much, Brad. It's great to see you, my friend. It's really great to take a moment to recognize the 25th year of the IAB.
So let's talk about you. I always like these conversations to be kind of a three-act play. Act one is all about Rich. So talk with us about where you were in '96. You've been working in advertising. You were working in advertising before the internet. So what were you doing in '96? What was your pre-digital experience? And then how did you get involved with this crazy internet stuff?
So back in '96, I was working at an ad agency in New York, and I had been there for 17 years in traditional advertising. So I was working with blue chip clients like Procter and Texsize, Avon, DuPont, Marriott. And I was just a account person at an ad agency. And then I saw this thing called the information superhighway, because one of my big accounts that I ran was AT&T. And we talked about the information superhighway. And every time I talked about the information superhighway, everybody's eyes rolled in the back of their head and they're like, don't you realize that we make our money in television and it's not about this, Orlando trial and all this other stuff that's going on. So I saw the potential of the internet in the fall of '95, and I saw my first browser, I saw my first web page, and I was absolutely smitten from the first day that I saw it.
And so let's skip ahead, right? So
yeah.
We're going to talk about where you were then, but like, what is Archer Advisors, and what is the 4A's Institute that you're the director of?
So Archer Advisors, I've been running for the last 15 years after I was a venture capitalist in San Francisco. And it is a strategic advisory for fundraising, sales, and trade marketing. And I've worked with 65 startups in the last 15 years, helping them in those different areas. And I'm thrilled to say that recently I become the program director for the 4A's Institute of Advanced Advertising Studies in San Francisco, where I train a handful of up and coming rising stars in the ad agency business that are in account management, creative, data analytics, production. And I'm helping them understand the nuts and bolts of the ad agency business via a pitch. And it's so gratifying to come full circle back to the agency world, because it's almost like I never left. Things are massively different, but in many ways, things are still the same.
So the thing I want to tee up, and I may wind up saying it again, but I want to frame this conversation by saying that you are the person who has most continuously been associated with the IAB from the moments of its inception until now. You attend the board meetings. You're the person who's been there most continuously and the longest. So that's one of the reasons why not only I wanted to have the first conversation with you, but that I'm hoping that you'll be my partner in crime as we have a series of these conversations to celebrate the 25th anniversary. So one of the things I want to frame up also is that it's a delightfully and in some ways peculiarly American thing to start an association. And this has been something that's been true of our country for a long, long time. And I found this quote that I want to share. We're going to put it on the screen so you can read along, which is, it's from de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. So let me read it. It's, Americans of all ages, all conditions and all dispositions, constantly form associations. They've not only commercial and manufacturing companies in which all take part, but associations of 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, serious, feudal, extensive or restricted, enormous or diminutive. The Americans make associations to give entertainments, to found establishments for education, to build inns, to construct churches, to diffuse books, to send missionaries to the Antipodes. And in this manner, they found hospitals, prisons, and schools. If it be proposed to advance some truth, or to foster some feeling by the encouragement of a great example, they form a society. Wherever, at the head of some new undertaking, you see the government in France or a man of rank in England, in the United States, you will be sure to find an association. And it's a long quote, it's a very long book, but I wanted to read it because, golly, IAB US was the first IAB. We now have them in dozens and dozens of countries. And again, it was a peculiarly American thing to say, gosh, this internet advertising stuff is bubbling up. Maybe we should form an association. So what happened in 1996? What was the impetus around starting the IAB?
Well, it was an article that Tim Clark wrote in Interactive Week where he said we should have an association for the industry. There are associations for other media types, and we should form one. So that was kind of a coalescing moment. And when I read that article, I'm like, of course, this makes an awful lot of sense. So there was just a natural attraction for all of us in the internet to come together. And you got to remember, at that time, everybody was helping everybody else out because we weren't necessarily an established medium. So there was a Jupiter conference where a whole bunch of people were speaking. I was speaking there from Starwave, where I was the head of ad sales for ESPN. And we just all coalesced and went to that March 6th meeting in 1996 at CNET. And we had about 32 people from companies like Yahoo, Netscape, At Home, Time Warner, Hotwired. We had the guy that sold the first banner ad, Rick Boyce from Hotwired. And we all came together and said, what do we want to create? And we had some great conversations, and it was just like a natural attraction for us all to help each other out.
In 1996 the internet was a much different place than it is now. This was before Google, which was founded in 98. It was before
Right.
Facebook, which was founded in 2004. It was before the mobile internet became a big thing. The iPhone didn't happen until 2007, although the BlackBerry and the Trio and other devices predated it. Yahoo had only been founded a couple of years before in 94. AOL had been around for a while. It was founded in 1985. Both Yahoo and AOL are now part of Verizon. So I mean, again, like the internet was pretty new. And what kind of scale are we talking about? Like how big was the reality versus the future opportunity at the time?
Well, way back then, I think our first quarter of revenue was $30 million that we established with a PricewaterhouseCoopers study. And way back then, nobody took us seriously as a advertising medium. In the advertising agency world, it was looked at as a value add. If you bought Bon Appetit, you would get bonappetit.com as a value add. It would be thrown in. People wouldn't pay for it. And when I was at the agency, I said to the head of media, I'm thinking of going into internet ad sales. And she said, why would you do that? We get all that stuff for free. And so, I didn't take no for an answer. And we all got together to get taken seriously. And I think one of the formative things about the IAB is we early on saw that we were a media type, just like magazine, just like television, just like outdoor. And we really wanted to establish ourselves as an advertising medium. It was really hard back then. When I was head of sales for ESPN, I spent 6 months trying to get my first deal. It was, it was hard to find somebody at an agency to take meetings. There weren't very many interactive agencies at the time. There was, Moda Media, there was Messner, but it was very hard to actually make some sales. So we came together to help each other out. And as the IAB grew and went from year to year to year, it became almost like a therapy session where we all got together. We were kindred spirits, fighting the good fight. And really, as we started to grow, it was a very rewarding experience in terms of all the things that we were able to do in the first 5 years. I was the chairman for the first 5 years, and then it kind of went on to other folks. Shelby Bonney was the next chairman, and he was really instrumental in helping us out in 2001 because that was right around the downturn, and we were having financial problems with the IAB, and he had the idea of prepaying your dues ahead of time, and that actually saved the IAB. And he was the head of CNET, which is kind of a full circle thing because CNET is where we had our first meeting in 1996.
So at that first meeting, who was there?
Well, we had Richie Glassberg from Turner. We had Scott Schiller from Prodigy. We had Kate Everthorpe from CNET. We had Leslie Laredo. We had At Home. We had all the companies that kind of mattered at the time in the interactive world, and probably half of them don't exist anymore. And what was really interesting is we set upon figuring out what are we going to do, and we very quickly focused on revenue producing web properties, or as we called them back then, publishers. And that's because we had other companies in the room that were like ad serving companies or measurement companies. And through the discussions, it became very clear that they had very different needs and priorities versus the sales side. So we were always about proving the effectiveness of online advertising. And we had a saying back then is a rising tide raises all boats. Another thing that we always said was check your ego at the door, check your company at the door, because we're here for the greater good. And, I kind of found myself at the whiteboard kind of taking down notes because I was an ex-agency person and I have a great experience in herding cats. And there were a lot of cats in that room. Think of a bunch of ad sales people in a room and trying to figure out what we wanted to do. But that March meeting, we followed up with a meeting in New York in April where we had another 30 folks, where we had additional folks kind of being interested. We talked about how are we going to pay for this. We talked about a $3,000 dues for all the IAB members, which was an astronomical sum for, an association of like, I don't know what you do. We established our steering committee. We did a whole bunch of things back in that first room. And again, it was that collective spirit of we can do this together. And it was really all of those people in the room that kind of rose and created the IAB.
One thing I think it's remarkable, we tend to measure internet things in dog years. So really it's the 175th anniversary of the IAB, just in terms of like, the felt time. But I think everyone who was in that room back in 96, the first room in CNET is still alive. And many people are still working in the industry, which is remarkable. We just had Scott Schiller talk at ALM last week, for example, and
Right.
Richie Glassberg. I talk to him all the time. So we haven't lost anybody, in the kind of grand scheme of things, and many people are still working in the industry.
Yeah, it's great. And, some people took a time out during the downturn and came back to the industry. The industry is just grown dramatically. Steve Goldberg, who was one of our founding board members from Microsoft, observed the other day, and I'm not sure I'm going to get it right, but he basically said, we had great hopes for the internet back then, and we thought it was going to be huge, but we never imagined it's going to be as big as it is right now.
And it wasn't originally the IAB. There was an earlier name and then a name change. Can you tell me about that?
Yes. So we started off as the Internet Advertising Council. And, there's the Ad Council, there's, we had thought our council sort of description was the way to go. But then IAC Corp, we thought that they would not like IAC as a competitor. So we changed it to the IAB. in June of 96. So,
and that connects to other trade associations like the Radio Advertising Bureau. So it
Television
makes sense.
Advertising Bureau, yeah.
So, and then, golly, it was all volunteer. Nobody
Right.
got paid from the IB for quite some time.
That's correct. So for the first 5 years, it was all volunteer, and I ran the IAB as the founding chairman, essentially as the day-to-day CEO, and I thought of it as my second job. Many other people spent an awful lot of time doing things like Richie Glassberg helping with our first banner guidelines and our T's and C's. And there was just a tremendous amount of work. Right now, if you think about, well, let's do an update to the banner guidelines or the video ad standards, you'd say, well, let's put together a committee, and there's a very specific process that the IAB has developed over time. But back then, it was absolutely herding cats. And Richie was able to use his people at Turner to actually look at all the different banner sizes and crawl the web back then and see that there were like about 8 common sizes. So he was able to work with the different publishers to reconfigure the banner guidelines. And the reason why that was important was because agencies were spending an awful lot of money just resizing ads. In the traditional world, it was really easy to resize a print ad. You kind of just scaled it, you just moved it around. But with the internet, with banners, as everybody knows, like if you resize something and it's not exactly the right size, you'll get white little dots where the pixels aren't filled in. So agencies were spending a tremendous amount of time figuring that out. Publishers all had different banner guidelines because they were all startups. And we started to coalesce and socialize this whole idea of what the banner guidelines are. Again, pretty easy to do today. Back then, it was a real problem. And I ran against a real roadblock as we were trying to work with the 4As in the ANA back then. They were part of something called the Coalition for Ad-Supported Interactive Entertainment, or CASE. And I went to them and I said, hey, and these were really great partners, Robin Webster from the ANA and Mike Donahue from the 4As. And I said, this is what we'd like to do for our banner guidelines. And they're like, no, Rich, we've got it all figured out. Have you heard of a standard advertising unit in newspaper? Basically, it's like on a diagonal, it's on a grid, and you just kind of resize it, and then it'll be really easy to do it that way. And I said, you know what? We're a bunch of startups. We can't redesign all of our websites based on this SAU approach. So we've got these banner guidelines, and we were able to convince them that that was the right way to go. So that was an important step that I think really helped scale some of the revenue.
Someone recently compared that work to making sure that early American railways, that the train tracks were all the same, that you didn't want to have different trains every time you went from one municipality to the next. And so that's, from standardization comes scale. So the T's and C's and the standard ad units were an early triumph. What were the biggest obstacles, aside from the other trade associations you were saying? Like what, you hear you've got a ragtag bunch of volunteers. Like what were the biggest hurdles early on?
Well, I think, I wouldn't call us ragtag. I know that was meant in a very
it was meant affectionately, but perhaps it didn't come across that way.
Very loving way. We were all professional people. The IB that back then, even though it was young and early, we were extremely professional. We had a PR agency, we had a bunch of committees, we were developing a whole bunch of different things. And I think, part of the challenge back then was just making sure that we got everything we wanted to get done. And I think some of the big issues back then was nobody was taking us seriously. They thought, we were just a value add, as I mentioned before. So we instituted, in partnership with PricewaterhouseCoopers, the online advertising revenue report as air cover for our salespeople to say, hey, listen, people are really spending money in this medium. And in the early days, Netscape and AOL were doing big placements, but nobody believed that they were actually advertised spending $1 million for placements. So that was a really big hurdle for us in actually getting the rates that we wanted to get. Because in those early days, we didn't have CPMs, we didn't have guarantees, we didn't have third-party ad serving. We didn't have a lot of the tools that we had to kind of measure and equalize the industry. And measurement back then, just like it is today, and just like it is evolving to be even more challenging as we start to look with the loss of the cookie, measurement is, was one of our big hurdles. And we had panels back then, PC Meter, ComScore, Nielsen, Ad Relevance. We had a bunch of different companies, iPro, that did measurements, and they were all different. And that was a really, really big challenge.
Let's just go back. You said $30 million. The PwC report, which, by the way, just PSA for our audience, then this has been going on continually since the IAB's foundation, and the next one is being released in early April. I think on April 7th. I'm not entirely sure of that date, but next month. This is this long time benchmark longitudinal study. So that gave you air cover. I guess I'm also curious, sort of like, let's start looking back at how things have changed. I mean, as I said earlier, you've been the single most involved person for the duration of the IAB's existence. If you had to pick a couple of things that are the most different, as you know, one of them is $30 million, which was, in television terms, not a considerable amount of money even 25 years ago. From $30 million to, digital is the dominant part of the advertising spend in this country right now and in much of the world. That obviously, from the smallest player to the largest, or at least one of the largest, is one thing that happened over a quarter century. What are the other big changes?
Well, I think fundamentally, we were in a television-based economy in the advertising business back then. And agencies in 96, 97 had a wake me when it's over attitude. Like, I don't know about this internet, I'm hoping to retire before I actually have to deal with this. And they just really didn't care. And over time, when we got to 99 with the bubble, people started to pay attention, but it was kind of artificial attention because of stock prices in Wall Street. And then when there was the crash and the correction in online advertising, stocks, a lot of agency people said, you see, I thought it was just a fad. It wasn't real. So we had a lot of struggles in terms of getting respect and getting recognition in the industry. Obviously, there were certain agencies that got it, but there were a lot of agencies that didn't get it. And so what has changed dramatically is the agencies embracing online advertising, embracing data, buying data companies, buying privacy companies. It's changed dramatically. And we always looked at the holding companies and the agencies and said, you know what, they're just not technology companies. It's just not what they do. And that has changed dramatically. And I think fundamentally, the agency world has been a big driver in understanding how this, I'm kind of getting legitimacy, because as I said, when I first started, I couldn't get arrested, in terms of, selling anything. And, I did get a whole bunch of sales after 6 months, but it was really, really, really challenging. It was pioneering stuff. But I think the biggest change is agencies get it, brands get it. Look at programmatic. Programmatic is, kind of taken over the world. We never in a million years thought that programmatic was going to be the powerhouse that it was. And I remember when I was a VC in the 2000, I saw a whole bunch of startups that were starting to look at programmatic in those early stages. And it just, none of them really took off until, we had some of the, other companies that came in. But I think, the agency's embracement, if that's a word, of technology and online advertising, I think has been a big, big change. And again, a lot of that is probably driven by clients. Clients understand that's where consumers are. And, I think that's been the biggest change in the last 25 years.
And earlier you mentioned that in that first meeting, you alighted quickly on the idea that this was primarily an association for publishers and sell side folks, and yet
Right.
in 2018 the IAB welcomed brands as full members. And would you have imagined that clients would be members of the IAB back 25 years ago?
I probably would have imagined that agencies would be members before clients because we were more aligned with agencies. But one of the tricky things about that is that there is a, buyer seller sort of tension in terms of, how sellers work with buyers. And so part of, what we've always wanted to do was to be an active voice for the sell side. And there was a moment back in 1996 when I was working with KC and the A&As and the 4As, and they said to me, listen, Rich, you should be part of KC. You don't need to be your own organization. And I said, no, that's not at all. We are just like, the TVAB, the Magazine Association. We are not a second-class citizen. And I saw that we should be like our offset, or that we would go and interface with was the agencies and what were the clients. I wouldn't have imagined, the brands being part of our membership and our board, but they've added a tremendous amount in terms of our perspective. I think, Randy Rothenberg has been, a driving force in getting brands into this organization. And he has really, made the case that a lot of the D2C brands and the innovation that they're bringing both to that category, also legacy brands, we share more in common with D2C brands than you would imagine. The same sort of data practices, same sort of privacy practices, focus on metrics. So that kind of was a easy evolution, although, the board has looked at allowing agencies and members in over time, and we've had significant debates in terms of whether it was a good idea or a bad idea. We didn't do it instantly, it took some time, but I think we all would agree that it's a wonderful evolution and step forward with the IAB. So
as we're starting to transition into the sort of last moments of our chat today, you're a young man. I think that you'll be celebrating the 50th anniversary of the IAB, and I hope I will be as well, in 25 more years. Yeah. As you're looking forward, what do you think the next greatest challenges and opportunities are for the IAB? We saw last week, for example, at ALM, an extraordinary amount of thought going into what comes after the third-party cookie, what comes after the changes to iOS 14. Those will be long in the rearview mirror by the time we get to 25 years from now. We're seeing an extraordinary amount of activity around artificial intelligence. We're also seeing, the sort of journey of the internet from the back room on a dial-up connection to in everybody's pocket or their hand with a handset, popping onto people's faces with heads-up display. So many things are going to change. So from your seat, if you could pick one or two things that you think we should be thinking about for the next 25 years, what would they be?
Well, I think one is kind of esoteric, which is kind of keeping the humanity in our business, in our interaction with consumers. As things become more machine to machine and, kind of humans are less part of the equation, just kind of keeping the humanity in terms of how we work with consumers, I think is super, super important. And I think that's also segues nicely into our immediate challenges, which is, how do we deal with privacy and identity? And I think part of what we've lost over time is what's the value to the consumer. The consumer's got to be at the center of all of this. And I think if over the next 25 years we keep that in mind, I think that is going to be a good kind of North Star for us to go to. I think one of the things that we've also lost over time is recognize the value of consumers in the media that they are creating. So when audiences show up for an Oprah interview, for example, and everybody wants to watch it, it's those individuals coming together that make those ad units so valuable, but the consumer doesn't get to participate in the economic value that they're creating. I can see a future where there is much more of an interplay, where there's value creation coming from the consumer, but also coming back from the company. So you might get free, and this is not that hard to imagine, but you could get free Verizon service for looking at ads. You could get a rev share for buying insurance on your phone, and that's called a discount. But there could be a larger sort of value creation that is accrued to consumers over the next 25 years. It's been tried with micropayments. It's really been kind of kludgy, hasn't really established itself. But I think that's kind of full circle where we're going to go, in that the consumer needs to be more a part of our industry. I don't think we've done it, out of any ill will. I just think we need to bring them back in as we think about privacy, as we think about identity. And I think that's going to be a guiding star for us over the next 25 years.
And we heard again and again last week at ALM about the sort of our need as an industry to come up with, and the phrase, it's a bit bloodless, the consumer value exchange. And I think that frequently consumers don't see it as an exchange because one exchanges things willingly. I think they see it as more of a tax. And so that's part of the pivot that you're talking about, is not only reframing what's already happening to people who are customers, citizens, and also consumers, but also changing what's actually happening. So this is a dialogue, and thank you. I'm so glad to see you. In the next meeting, it'll be a trialogue. We'll have someone else, it'll be the two of us, and we're going to continue this look back and look forward for the IAB. So Rich Lafergie, thank you so much for joining us on IAB There. I'm going to move to the credits, and I'll see you again very soon. IAB There is a production of the Interactive Advertising Bureau. Our show today was produced by Connor Healy and John Ward. I'm Brad Behrens, Editor-in-Chief here at the IAB. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope we'll see you again soon. Bye-bye, everybody.